Hey everybody. So we're going to look at chapter 11. This might be a little bit of a shorter chapter. Depends on how much digression I do, I suppose. So this age from 1820 to 1860, we see two very different reform movements. Um, we start to see this common belief among most middle class people that all aspects of society can be improved through some type of social reform. Reform meaning changing laws, changing policies, changing attitudes to ideally improve society. Of course, the question becomes improve society based on whose standards? And that's significant because not everyone agrees on what is improvement. We also see, in addition to that, we also see by the 20s a lot of reformers wanting to use social discipline, morality, religion, Protestant religion, morality, and social discipline, along with regular church attendance and a very strict moral code. We see that by the 1820s. That's sort of our second Great Awakening, which we discussed the first Great Awakening back in the mid 1700s. We see it again in the 1820s. Really try to revive interest in church participation and to get people back on a good moral code, which many people believe, especially middle class Christians, believe that Americans are falling away from. We see church participation also increase. However, by the 30s and 40s, we get a whole second wave of reformers, which are a little less focused on Christian morality and a little more focused on individualism and sexual equality, gender equality. And we see some conflicts there between morality and more enlightened views. And we'll explore all of this in this chapter. So we'll start with this idea of individualism, the ethic of the middle class, Emerson, and Transcendentalism. Ralph Waldo Emerson, a literary hero in American history, really. He had been a preacher, a minister. He gave up his position. He then became a leader of an intellectual movement that we call Transcendentalism. What does Transcendentalism do? It is a response to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is often a response to the religious structure and the rigidity in Europe, using reason, science, logic. This is a movement away from Enlightenment thinking. However, it goes in a new direction. It isn't a response to Enlightenment that leads to a reinforcement of Christianity. It actually goes the other way. It moves away from Christianity, and it also moves away from science and reason. It goes in a third direction. Transcendentalism. So it rejects reason and science. However, it also rejects religion. It also rejects religion and the idea of God exactly. He wants to explore individuality. He wants to explore human passions, human emotions. Individuality to Emerson would be defined as, I'm paraphrasing, defined as a radically free and private person. Radically free and private person is a side of individuality. He believes America is losing that. Freedom is being lost due to industrialization or religious morality, and privacy as well. The increasing population growth, urbanization, the increasing focus on moral guidance and community guidance also leaves you're not really private or free anymore in this society, whether it's industrial or whether it's religious. He believes people are often trapped by traditions and customs from an earlier time. This often leads us to like the idea of morality, patriarchy. He rejects a lot of those things. That doesn't mean he's immoral, more of amoral, absent morality, it's about ethics, really. He also believes human society's desire for consumer goods, material goods, which of course is a direct result of the Industrial Revolution. He believes that's a problem too. People are striving for material gains, and they're of course losing their spirituality. They're losing their soul in the process. He believes in the idea of an open sky. Um, this where a person should seek union with the universe. This isn't about a god. This was almost more in line with some of our modern thinking about I think of like AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. They're and again I'm not intimately familiar with that, but the idea that you seek guidance or assistance or absolution of some sort in however you understand God or however you understand spirituality. Many people are not necessarily believing in God, but they believe in some type of higher power, some type of spirituality. That's transcendentalism, part of it. Not God per se, but there's some sort of a higher spirituality, some type of a higher power, something more powerful than us. Not necessarily God, a universal power, if you will. And if you believe in this open sky, it literally lay out in a field and stare up at the universe and will yourself to become one with the universe. But it is a rejection of traditional Christian religion, but also a rejection of industrial revolution and science and technology. Very interesting. Emerson's Lycean movement grows out of this. In essence, they're schools. They're schools and lectures that teach transcendentalism and the ideas behind it. He starts building these public lectures, these meetings, these discussion groups. Even they have like these little schools, pop-up schools, sort of as a term to use, sort of a modern term. He did lecture tours. It was all about fostering discussion among the educated. This was a middle class movement that I said at the beginning on the title page. This is a middle class movement for changing to reforming things, believing to make things better in Emerson's view. But it really focused on educated middle class people, which was a very small percentage of the population, truthfully. 10-20% of the population really fit into this category. Focusing on poets and scientists, reformers, teachers, things like this. Intellectual discussion. In many ways, it was modeled. Lyceum, of course, was Aristotle's school, I believe, and so it's modeled on Aristotle's ideas, going back to ancient Greece over well over 2,000 years. Massachusetts had over 150 lyceums by the mid 1800s. Over 150 of these lyceums all across Massachusetts. It did extend into some other states, but this is primarily in Massachusetts, which was one of the most progressive, and we do say in modern history that in early America, the first 100 years, the most progressive state or colony was Massachusetts out of all. It really was. They were the first ones to really become aggressive on abolition. You found more gender equality in Massachusetts, even though it was very religiously organized. You also find once the revolution begins, many of our patriot leaders come right from Massachusetts. So it is really a leader and progressive, even though that's a term they would use back then. It was probably the most progressive state or colony. It certainly was. In this time, of course, state. Hundreds of them, and Emerson was the most popular speaker. There were other transcendentalists. Um, and he alone, something like 1,500 lectures in his lifetime before he died. 1,500 lectures in 300 different towns. Very interesting. He really creates a new literary. Probably his greatest influence is he creates multiple types of new communities based on this new type of spiritualism, and he also inspires many authors, many literary authors and poets. Probably maybe his greatest influence, really. Well, we're gonna look at two sides of this. People who were very hopeful and very optimistic about the future based on transcendentalist ideas, and then you're going to have the negative view of it. People that were very pessimistic about the effect transcendentalism would have upon our society. Hopeful, we look at Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, Walt Whitman. Let's start with Henry David Thoreau first. He built a cabin at Walden Pond. This is like right outside of Boston, somewhere in the Boston area. He lived there for 2 years alone. Although he didn't live off, he wanted to connect with nature, but he didn't live off the. Put it this way, he didn't live as a natural mountain man or something like that. I mean, his brother brought him food and supplies and stuff. So um, he was still influential, though. He did live out there, tried to become one with the open sky and nature. He wrote Walden or Life in the Woods, really about a search for meaning in the natural world. Yeah, as long as someone from the real world is still bringing you food. He proposed civil disobedience, the idea of obeying laws peacefully or disobeying laws peacefully as a form of protest. Civil disobedience. He also is the one where you get this terminology: a man must march to the tune of his own drum. That really comes out of his Walden. He is influential, very very influential in American history. He's influential upon Gandhi. He's influential upon Martin Luther King Jr. This idea of civil disobedience. So the echoes of Henry David Thoreau go well for the next 200 years. They're highly influential. Still affects us today. Another one is Margaret Fuller, a woman in this Transcendentalist movement, a leader in the movement. She was very accomplished intellectual. She explored freedom for women. She edited the Dial, which is a transcendentalist journal. She published Women in the 19th Century, which was incredibly controversial. It proposed a whole new gender relationship in American society where men and women would be equal. What? Men and women equal? What? WTF, man. The idea that men and women would be treated equal in society, in business, and that each would have full independence of the other. Yeah, in the 1820s and 1830s, I mean, this kind of shit in America just got people hating you and disliking you and maybe giving you death threats. In Europe, this kind of stuff would get you executed. And even the same year, this kind of stuff got women talked about this kind of stuff in the early 1800s in France, and they cut off their heads. So this was dangerous shit. America was a different place than France, but understand this was how dangerous it was. People would have probably there was probably people who would have killed her if they could have gotten away with it. The idea of total equality of men and women, that women are fully equal to men, that's blasphemy for many people in this time period. Um, she also was very religious, though. She said they would actually be serving God, equally under God, as the Bible intended, equally under God. She was also a literary critic for the New York Tribune. She traveled the world. One of the most well known and most cosmopolitan women in the world at the time period, probably, Western world anyway. Egalitarian, meaning equality, everybody fair, everyone equal. There are elements in this of socialism, which would have probably not appealed to some people. Some people might have had issues with that. Let's see. Walt Whitman was a printer, teacher, journalist, newspaper editor. He was sort of the Renaissance man. Long after the Renaissance, he did everything. He could do anything. Um, he published Leaves of Grass, which is poetry, celebrating the desire to break from tradition. And he also spoke about the invisible boundaries that society's placed on us and that we place on ourselves. This would certainly apply to like women. You've heard about the glass ceiling of women. While that's not a term they use in this time period, it sort of applies this invisible boundary that you can't get past because society has put these rules on you and put these restrictions that women can only do this, or poor people can only do this, or black people can only do this. Um, and the thing is, so many people they buy into it. You hear it your whole life. You hear it your whole life that you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, and it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. You just can't do it, even though you actually could. But you can't because people don't want you to do it. And then you actually sort of train yourself that you can't do it as well. So these are boundaries that are put on us that sometimes we don't even know exist. But society, it's societal structure, it's socio-cultural, socio-economic structure. And he says you need to break those boundaries if you can. Try to get outside the box. You know, get outside the box. Sorry, I just can't help but thinking of Taco Bell. I would love some Taco Bell right now. All right, more pessimistic views, more negative views of this. The idea that transcendentalism is actually dangerous. Well, Nathaniel Hawthorne's ideas, the Scarlet Letter, published in 1850, it criticized individualism. In essence, the story is that the main characters ignore social norms, they ignore cultural religious norms, they have sex, they have a child through adultery, and it destroys everyone's lives. Destroys their lives, destroys their kids' lives, it just destroys everything. It wrecks an entire community, all because, a guy couldn't keep it in his pants. That's what it amounts to, really. And it's all about anti-individualism. Being individual, going your own way, being fully independent and private means that ultimately it impacts everybody else. You might think it only affects you, but it actually affects it has reverberating waves to the whole community. Um, yeah. Herman Melville, of course, the Moby Dick, one of the most classic books of literature in America. Published this in 51, which is this personal question of Captain Ahab against the white whale. It ultimately leads to destruction of everything. Ultimately, it leads to his death, the death of his crew, destruction of his ship. He brings misery and tragedy to his crew and families, all because of his own personal, individual quest for vengeance. So his very anti-transcendental. This idea that he lacks restraint, he lacks discipline, he lacks moral conformity and uniformity, and he brings death and destruction to all those around him. Interesting. This is far more liberal and progressive. This is far more conservative and fundamentalist. And this is where the majority society seems to lean more towards the pessimistic view of transcendentalist ideas. All right. Another very important intellectual movement at the time, and it's really an intellectual movement because abolition has almost no impact upon the laws of society in this time period. Very little impact upon laws or even changing most people's beliefs or policies or anything. This is really more of an intellectual exercise for the most part. Um, it's significant because it does have influence in later years, of course. I mean, it's only 40 years after this all really begins, and of course, slavery ends. But in this time period, in the early 1800s, it is not. Bottom line, very few people are abolitionists. This is a minor movement that does grow over the years, but even by the time of the war, 1860, when it starts, most people are not abolitionists. They just aren't. Racial uplift. We'll start with the northern free blacks, often tried to focus on this racial uplift, social uplift, as a way to elevate themselves through, and I'm going to get to David Walker in a second, as a way to elevate themselves through education, hard work, and temperance. Temperance meaning limiting drinking. Um, so get educated if possible, work hard, provide for a family, limit your drinking, of course. Again, still a very strong belief, the root of all evil in any part of the society, poor, rich, white, black, doesn't matter, is alcohol. And we see African Americans found a variety of schools and social institutions, churches, self-help associations, different community organizations, all to help free blacks. Now, in 1829, I don't know how many slaves there were. I'm going to say probably close to 2 million. give or take. We know that approximately 10% of the black population was free all through this time period. So that would imply that approximately 200,000 free blacks. A lot. The majority of them actually still live in the South. They still live in slave society even though they're free. But a significant percentage do live in northern states. And we do see some middle class African Americans, some educated African Americans advocating for equality. Most are not advocating for abolition. In this time period, abolition is a blasphemous word. To actually abolish or end slavery, how would you hear it rephrased? Them's fighting words, really. So most people were really, really quiet about talking about outright abolition of slavery. You didn't talk about that on the street corner, just where anyone could hear. That was a private conversation you had among like-minded individuals, because that's the kind of stuff that literally could cause fights or even get you killed. So abolition was not a big thing. But that doesn't mean that they didn't talk about it privately and they didn't want to try and end or mitigate the effects of slavery. Certainly we tried. But the big focus in the North, where there are not many slaves, is really about trying to increase opportunities for the free blacks living in the northern states. In response to this, we often will see white violence retaliating. If they did have public rallies or meetings, and as will happen, as more and more slaves do actually escape, and they will have public meetings and public speeches in places like Massachusetts and northern states, we will see white mobs attacking. Even though there's not much slavery in the North, you will still see this happening because it needs to be made clear all the way through the time of the ending of slavery, even after slavery ends, even then, most white people do not consider blacks equal to white. Very clearly. Even without slavery, most whites would consider blacks inferior, even without slavery. So it isn't that they think blacks are equal, even if they don't agree with slavery or want to abolish it. Um, so we see white mobs, New York, Boston. This is basically terrorism. It's domestic terrorism, violence, attacks. We see uh, all kinds of stuff. People are killed over this idea. Well, into all this comes David Walker's appeal. David Walker was an escaped slave. He wrote this. Let me correct that. I don't have it in my notes. I think he was an escaped slave. So let me. I'm not going to quote that. I'm not positive about that. Yeah, you can check your book for that. I was thinking it was, but it's not in my notes. So not positive about that. He wrote it, quote, to the colored citizens of the world. He wrote it to the colored citizens of the world. It was a response to all of this violence against blacks. Not against slaves per se, but against more of the free black population. Walker, he was a black from North Carolina. He moved to Boston and he was self educated. He often ridiculed religious justification for slavery, believing it was no religious justification for slavery. He justified slave rebellion. He believed slaves should actually openly rebel against the slave masters in the South. And he also warned the white population everywhere that if black people did not, well, let me say it this way, if black people were continued to be denied justice, you would ultimately see a mass slave uprising, which would probably result in the deaths of many white people. In other words, give us freedom, give us equality, or you're going to see a war, a race war, brought on by the blacks. That never happens. Never even comes close or even begins to happen, anything like that. But he warns it's going to happen. And of course, you must understand many white people believe this. Many white people really truly believed at any time there was going to be a mass uprising by blacks, free and slave, to overthrow the white population. Mathematically impossible, never could have happened. Almost all weapons were in the hands of whites, and whites outnumber blacks 9-1, 8-1. So this was literally impossible. Could never have happened. But whites constantly feared it. Free territories in the free states or slave states, doesn't matter. They all feared uprisings by blacks. It was a common feeling, a common part of the culture. Newspapers wrote about it, books were written about it. It was just part of the common culture. Um, in 1830, there was a national convention of black leaders, a black national convention of free blacks, and David Walker's appeal came out the year before. They reject it wholeheartedly, completely reject it. Why? Good discussion question. Why did this black convention of free black leaders who wanted education and work and temperance and more opportunities for blacks, opportunities for black people to move into the middle class and have jobs and careers and success, why did they wholeheartedly reject David Walker's appeal? Think of what David Walker was asking for. Think what the repercussions would have been had the free black community started championing David Walker's slave rebellion ideas. Think about it. Think what the effects would have been upon the free black community. It would have been quite dramatic. Um, think about that, and think about if there were other reasons why they chose not to do it. Other reasons than just what would have happened from the whites in response to the a large number of middle class black people championing slave rebellion and a black uprising overthrowing the white majority. Think about the effects of that. That's really a good discussion question. I like that one. They met in Philadelphia, by the way. They talked about political action. They did talk about protest. They did talk about protesting the mistreatment of blacks, certainly. Um, certainly talked about. They demanded more freedom and equality. There was a quote that was often used referring to free blacks in America, slaves in the midst of freedom. I forget who said that quote. I mean, it might have been Du Bois or something like that. I'm not positive. But what it meant, in essence, was they're free, but even as free blacks, they're still treated as second or third class citizens. They're still sort of slaves. They have very limited economic opportunity, educational opportunity, social advancement opportunity. They're treated as children. They have almost no legal rights. Many places they couldn't even own land. They couldn't vote. So free, yeah, they're free, but still, it's a form of slavery, really. Yeah, Nat Turner's revolt. Here's one of these revolts that happens, inspired by David Walker's appeal. The same time, Walker's trying to stir up the black community to action. Nat Turner, which is a slave in Virginia. I think there was actually a movie made about this recently. A slave in Virginia. He taught himself to read. He stages a revolt. He actually has visions from God. He he probably had mental illness. He had visions from God. He had visions. He had this religious conversion. He believed God told him to fight against the serpent and kill the serpent. And Nat Turner interpreted the serpent as the white slave owners and slave society. He probably had a mental breakdown. He had been separated from his wife. He had been shipped off to a different plantation or something. He had been beaten. He sort of had a break. He had a sort of this break, and he decides he's some type of religious prophet. He incites this revolt, and it's bad. He does it with friends and other slaves. Also, there's some white people involved in this. There's some white people involved with it as well. 55 people are killed. Nat Turner's revolt kills men, women, and children, kills and slaughters some people. He's eventually caught. He's hung. The leaders of the revolt are hung. Their heads are cut off and put on poles in the community. Who used to do this in ancient times? The Romans would do this. When there were slave uprisings, and this is probably someone who studied Roman history gave them the idea to do this. Romans would do this. When there were slave uprisings, the Romans would kill the slaves and put their heads on poles outside of Rome, the city of Rome. As a result of this, we see a lot of severe backlash from whites. We see changes in laws and policies. We see new black codes, new restrictions on literacy, restrictions on movement. It now became illegal to teach a black person to read. You now could not go anywhere as a black, free or slave, unless you had paperwork. And if you were caught as a free black without paperwork indicating you were a free black, you might very well find yourself put into slavery, even if you never were a slave. Even if you're born free, you might find yourself put into slavery. Um, you couldn't move around. Slavery got worse, as if slavery could get worse. Well, in Virginia, it could. Virginia, you better believe it could. The probably the most lenient form of slavery was Virginia, where many slaves were actually treated almost like members of the family. Still treated as a slave and as property, but they were treated much more fairly and equitably than, say, South Carolina or the Caribbean, Georgia. The further south you got, slavery was incredibly brutal. The only probably place that we would have sort of lenient slavery was in Virginia, Maryland area. That almost ends after Nat Turner's revolt. Slavery, they start putting more slaves in chains. They start more abuse, um, more violence, and they also, as we'll talk about, I think in the next chapter, this is also after Nat Turner's revolt where they really up the deportation of slaves, the movement of slaves from the north to the south, and they start doing this mass internal domestic slave trade where they start moving ultimately hundreds of thousands of slaves from the northern slave colonies, Virginia, Maryland area, down to the southern slave colonies like Louisiana, where slavery was much worse, much more brutal, and much shorter life expectancy. So the response was dramatic from like the Virginia Assembly, this is the Virginia government, for instance. Of course, they feared the two things: further slave revolts and uprisings, as Nat Turner, as pardon me, as David Walker suggested, and of course, more white people being killed. Eventually, I believe David Walker is assassinated. I think he's actually killed quickly. I think pretty quickly after this time period, he's actually killed as a result of his actions. Um, Assassinated, I believe. You could look that up. Your book probably tells you about that. Look at this. What do you immediately think? Another great discussion question. What do you see what do you look when you see this? What is this reminiscent of? It should be very obvious. Christianity, Christian theology. Who is this? This is David Walker. But in Christian theology, who would this be? And what did this particular individual some 2,500 years ago or 3,000 years ago, I forget exactly the year, Mount Sinai, exact the year, but something like 2,600, 2,700 years ago, something like that. Um, what did this individual receive? And who is this individual receiving it from? These should all be pretty obvious to you. Um, and David Walker is putting himself in this position that he is now this person. And it says here, I think it says justice and what does it say? Liberty, I believe. Ooh, you just got a real close up of me there, didn't you? You don't want to see me that close, did you? Justice and liberty. Yeah, this idea of justice and liberty being delivered from you know who up in the you know what, in the form of the you know what given to the you know who. I like all that. It also should be noted that anytime African Americans wrote anything in these time periods, they always had a foreword or a introduction by a white person. The reason for this is pretty simple. It was to give credibility to the document. Many whites, even intellectual, educated whites, wouldn't read something written by a black person unless it had been vetted, is the word we would use today, unless it had actually been read over and approved by another white intellectual first. It was simply the way it was. So even among the abolitionist community, racism and prejudice was still very common. Very interesting. All right, let's go further and talk a little more about abolition, evangelical abolition. So, evangelical abolition. I know I repeated myself there, but that's because I stopped and I started again. I'd have a drink. I was thirsty. William Lloyd Garrison, he was a printer in Massachusetts. He founded the New England Anti-Slavery Society. I don't have it listed on there. The New England Anti-Slavery Society. He published an abolitionist newspaper, Liberator, and again, most people are not abolitionists. It's a minority of people. He published this newspaper, The Liberator. He later establishes the American Anti-Slavery Society. Eventually, there's anti-slave societies all across America. Eventually, they devise a three-prong attack on slavery. They are going to attack slavery in all these ways: religiously, sympathetically, and legally, believing that the three-prong attack will be the most effective way to end slavery. It has an effect. It does have an effect. The greatest effect, again, is intellectual. It's an intellectual movement. We see very little effect upon the actual laws or policies. Matter of fact, in this time period, slavery is probably getting more oppressive in the South. Uh, it is getting more oppressive in the South. It's getting worse. But what it does is it does start to change the minds of a lot of Northerners, which is influential in the coming years. First part, the religious attack, we're going to look at. They want to appeal to religious people. They want to appeal to good Christians. With a man named Theodore Weld, they published the Bible Against Slavery in 1837. And what it does is it's a collection of Bible passages right out of the Christian Bible that discredit slavery. The Bible is really, there's a lot of things you have to understand. At the time of Jesus, slavery was common practice across the entire world. Slavery was everywhere. Almost every single society, every single culture on earth had slavery in some form. It was standard practice in the time period of the time of Jesus. And of course, he lived in the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire had millions of slaves. So slavery was standard. You can find hundreds of passages in the Bible that reference slavery, both positive and negative. But most of them seem to accept slavery. If you read them and you read them, try to read them without any type of bias, most of them simply talk about slavery as part of society. So the fact that many Southerners would actually use the Bible to justify slavery is actually understandable, because there's lots of passages in the Bible which talk about slavery as just part of life, just normal. But there are also passages in the Bible that talk about freeing slaves, releasing them from bondage, treating them fairly. So you can actually find a lot of passages in the Bible that also talk about freeing slaves, which was also common back then. Slavery was not a permanent condition in the Roman Empire. You could buy your way out of slavery. Slaves would own slaves. You could go fight in the gladiator arena and you could get your slavery. You could work and have your own job and purchase your own self out of slavery. Slavery was not a permanent condition in many societies. Some, yes, but in many societies it wasn't. Muslim societies, slaves could often fight, and if they were willing to fight, they would then be free from slavery. So it wasn't common. It wasn't uncommon back then for people to get out of slavery. So that's also in the Bible. So they put together passages talking about ending slavery, free from slavery, coming out of bondage, things like this. The Grimke sisters is another couple of ladies. They were raised in the South Carolina. This is really sort of about this crosses a line between sympathy and religion. There's some aspects of both in this. The sympathetic appeal and also the religious appeal. This probably leans more towards sympathetic, but you could be both. They were from the Carolinas. They convert to Quakerism. Quakers don't believe in slavery. They eventually leave. They move to Pennsylvania, which is a sort of a nominally free state. Most northern states don't actually have laws against slavery in this time period, although most northern states don't really have many slaves. Pennsylvania being one of those. Still a big Quaker influence in Pennsylvania. And they published this book, along with Weld as well. They published this book, America Slavery as It Is, Testimonies of 1,000 Witnesses, in 1839. It sold more than 100,000 copies and was the second most popular book of that year. Of course, what's the first most popular book? As it pretty much is in every year in America, what is the best-selling book? Yes, the Bible. It sold more than 100,000 copies. It was firsthand accounts and newspaper evidence of the atrocities of slavery, the violence of slavery, the brutality, the death, the torture, the mutilation, and the suffering that it caused. Firsthand accounts, though, of actually people who were slaves or observed slavery. really bring a lot of people's attention. You must understand, most people didn't really get slavery, understand it, or even care about it. Majority of folks didn't. If you were in the South, slavery was simply part of life. You accepted it. If you were in the North, most people would never see a slave or interact with slaves. They would never be in slave society. It's just like it's like today. This is really an apt comparison. How many of you worry about the daily lives of someone in India? Do you? No, probably not. Most of you probably never give a second thought to the daily lives of a typical Indian person in India on the other side of the world. That's really how it is. You might think, well, it's the same country. It's really the same. Most people lived and died within 5 miles of their home back then. Most people never saw slaves, never interacted with slaves. They had to work, most were poor. They had to work every single day just to feed their families, just to take care of their kids, just to put food on the table, to pay the rent. They were no more concerned with what the life was like of a slave 1,000 miles away in Carolina than they were concerned about what life was like for someone living on the other side of the world. It really didn't mean anything to most people. It just didn't. That doesn't mean they hated black people. They just were ambivalent. They just didn't care. This Bible against slavery, American slavery as it is, it does start to get more people's attention. And this was a huge part of this intellectual movement. Very little effect on the actual policies of our society, but it does get a lot more people aware of the situation, aware of the problem, and really starting to be more aware of how they might actually influence it or help it in some way or another. The Anti Slavery Society was certainly influential on both the sympathetic and the legal aspect. Anti slave societies really helped a lot organize a lot of meetings and speeches and protests, especially for the escaped slaves, what we call fugitive slave stories. Frederick Douglass wrote Fugitive Slave Story. It was the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, which is an excellent thing to read. It's 150 pages. You can find it on the internet. You should read it. It really tells what life was like. He was an escaped slave. Um, he ran away, escaped, and if I'm remembering correctly, he actually shipped himself to freedom. I think was that Frederick Douglass that did that. Don't quote me on that. There was someone who did that. Not sure if it was Frederick Douglass. Might have been. Someone actually shipped themselves to freedom. I think it might have been him. What they did was well, Frederick Douglass did, for instance, he taught himself to read and write. He learned it from a slave mistress at one point, and then he actually learned it. He got the ability to do some task work in town. He actually had some free time to work in town as a slave, make a little bit of money. And he actually got some local boys to actually teach him a little more language. And eventually he escapes to freedom. And the person, and I keep thinking it's him. What they did was they actually put themselves in a crate and labeled it for some northern town like Boston or something, and then they actually shipped. They put themselves in it and sealed it and paid the shipping, and then they shipped themselves to freedom. And then they broke out of the crate up there in Boston or wherever, and they were. Don't get me wrong, they're fugitives. They are technically still the property of someone else. So their entire rest of their life, at least until 1865, they have to live as a fugitive from justice, from Southern justice. And there's all kinds of stories like this. There was a couple, a woman who was so light skinned she was able to pass the white woman, and she had a black husband who they were both slaves, and she escaped to the north by pretending to be the white mistress with her black slave. But that's because she was so light skinned, she was able to pass the white woman, and they escaped to freedom. So there's lots of stories, lots of ways that people tried to do it. And Frederick Douglass is interesting in his book. He doesn't give the real exact details. He gives a general idea, but he doesn't give the exact details of how he got to freedom. And he says he doesn't do this because he doesn't want to ruin it for others. He gives some very vague idea, but he believes if he gives the real exact details of how he did it, then of course Southerners will see that and they will try to keep anyone else from doing the same thing. They'll be on the lookout for people trying to do similar action. But the anti-slave societies, the American Anti-Slave Society, took care of these people. They gave them jobs, they gave them shelter, along with other local abolitionists. And they organized these speeches and rallies and these different meetings. And the fugitive slave stories were one of the real sympathetic appeals because you actually heard from the mouths of people that were beaten, abused, assaulted, tortured. Frederick Douglass saw two other slaves murdered right in front of his face by whites. One of them was shot right in the head. I forget how the other one died. It might have been the same thing. So he watched just outright murder, which was perfectly legal. If you had a justification, you believed you had a reason to kill a slave, you could simply murder a slave and just kill him right there on the spot. It wasn't murder in the South. Another thing they do is they distribute thousands of pamphlets, little abolitionist pamphlets, all across the North and the South. Often through was we call the Great Postal Campaign around 35. Over a million pamphlets through the mail all across the U.S. from coast to coast, trying to get people's attention, trying to get people to focus on this and know what slavery was about. Coast to coast is a bit of an exaggeration. We didn't really have the West Coast. The West Coast was still primarily Mexico. Although I think we did have maybe some, we might have already been in the Oregon, Washington area, maybe. But California and was still Mexico. But I just want to get ahead of myself there, coast to coast, exactly. You know how bad it was with these coast postal campaign. It got to the point that in the South, due to things like the postal campaign and Walker's appeal and other kind of stuff like that, what we see is, let me tell you how crazy it got. It was not uncommon for Southerners to rally together, raid the local post office, take every single letter out, just empty out all the mail, and burn it in a bonfire, regardless of whose personal mail it was. Just because they knew in there somewhere there was probably some document, some pamphlet, some letter, some story that would be challenging slavery. They would burn down an entire post office or burn down all the mail, just to ensure that those couple of individual letters or documents did make it out of thousands of pieces of mail. To get the 5 bad ones, they would burn it all. This was a common thing that happened in the South. They were so afraid of the influence of these abolitionist ideas, how it could actually influence Southern thinking. They wanted to just make it non-existent, just to where the idea of talking about abolition didn't even exist in the South. Pretty crazy. The legal approach, Underground Railroad, of course, everyone's familiar with that. The Underground Railroad, I think I have an image of it here. It's not an official railroad, it's a metaphor to where Southerners would work, and because there were Southern sympathizers, there were people in the South that were sympathetic to ending slavery and abolishing slavery. You couldn't talk about it openly. You'd ruin your life or get yourself killed. But secretly, they would do this, and they would, in essence, they tried to ship people north. They would hide them. They would run them through the forest at night. They would hide them underground. They would disguise them, all kinds of things. Give them phony paperwork, all to try and get slaves into freedom. These were typically Southern whites and a handful of Southern blacks that were anti-slave, and they tried to help people get to the north. And they use the term railroad because railroads, were brand new technology in this time period. So it's just a sort of figurative, I guess. Is that right? Figurative. I don't know. I'm not an English person, English major. I don't know if it's figurative or a metaphor or I don't know. I'll go with figurative. I like that. You understand what I mean though, so it doesn't really matter. The third prong approach, legal. Actually trying to change the laws. Probably the least effective of the 3 strategies. The most effective, we think, is the sympathetic appeal. Of the 3, the most effective is probably sympathetic. Religiously, minimal effect, we believe, on Southerners. Sympathetic appeal to lots of people. It really tugged on their heartstrings. And legal may have had the least effect. The congressional petitions, for instance, in the 30s and 40s, we see hundreds of thousands of signatures, documents sent to Congress asking for Congress to end the slave trade, to prohibit new slaves, to end slavery completely. Congress did nothing. Matter of fact, it was so bad. You know what Congress did? I think it was 1840s. Congress actually issued a gag order on itself. In Congress, they issued a gag order on themselves, which was on the books for almost a decade, which actually made it. I don't know if illegal is the right term. Maybe it's a form of procedure, but the result was you could not even discuss the issue of slavery in Congress for almost a decade. Couldn't even discuss it. It was against the rules, against the law, however you want to put it. You were prohibited from discussing slavery in Congress or passing any laws or regulations regarding slavery for years. Why? Disunion, Civil War. There were people all the way in the 1820s talking about disunion and the Civil War, long before the war occurred. This talk was already becoming common by the 30s and 40s. So Congress's answer, let's not even talk about it. Their answer wasn't to abolish slavery. Their answer was simply to not even discuss it. This has almost no effect. The legal strategy seems to have really no effect or minimal. However, the sympathetic and religious appeal does matter. It does make a difference because by 1850s, we have over 500,000 members of different anti-slave societies. Every single state has at least one anti-slave society in the North. In the South, there were anti-slave societies as well, but they were secret. But anti-slave societies everywhere, hundreds of thousands of members, over 2,000 different societies, 2,000 different independent organizations across the US, all prohibiting or all advocating prohibiting slavery or ending slavery. Again, this is still a minority. America had 100, 120, 140 million, 150 million people. So this is still 1/300th of the population. So it's still a very small number of people. You say 500,000 is a lot. It is a lot of people. But in a 150 million country, it's really a very small number of people. Most people simply didn't care. I'm not saying most people were pro-slave. Most people were simply ambivalent. It simply wasn't a concern. They had too many other things to worry about. But it's impactful. That's still 500,000 people that are actively pushing to end slavery. It's significant. It just isn't overwhelming by any means. It means something. It's effective. Limited effectiveness. Great discussion question here. Is this a pro or anti-slave image? What do you think? Pro or anti-slave? Is this for slave society? Is this against slave society? Which is it? Really good question. Really good question. What do you think about this? Look at the whole picture. This is a Negro in his own country. That would imply Africa. Africa, which is sparse on resources, which it is, sparse on resources. Dead bodies, in case you didn't notice the skeleton. He's unclothed, carrying a spear, which is an old technology. So the question you need to ask to really clarify it, would this man be better where he is or better in America as a slave? Now, this will help you decide whether this is pro or anti-slave. Look at this picture from the perspective of the slave owners. And that'll tell you everything you need to know, really. Perspective of slave owners, the Negro, the technology, his clothing, where he's at, the dead bodies. And again, is this a pro or anti-slave image? From the perspective of the slave owner. Last thing I'll say, in 1800, they often looked at slavery and used the term it was a necessary evil. By the time period we are talking about now, the mid-1800s, they are now calling slavery a positive good. These are the slave owners saying this. Now, that should give you everything you need to really answer this question. All right. The Underground Railroad, right there. Underground Railroad, I already covered that. These are the free states. These are the slave states. By the 1850s, most northern states had actually passed laws outlawing slavery. Not all of them. So even in these states here, you might occasionally find slaves for two reasons. One, because the state hadn't completely outlawed it, even though it was generally not accepted. Some cities and counties would outlaw it completely, even if the state didn't. Secondly, slaves were property. So if you lived in the South and you were traveling in the North, you take your slaves with you, they're still your slaves. So if you are a Virginia slave owner and you have slaves and you're traveling through Vermont, you would have your slaves with you. And if you moved to Vermont, that was also tricky too, because some of these states did not outlaw slavery, even if they discouraged it or didn't want you to have slaves. If you were a slave owner and you moved to a free state, you might still be able to keep your slaves. It was a gray area. Don't get me wrong, that probably didn't happen often, very rarely. But yeah, it was a gray area because it's your property. You wouldn't move to Vermont and they take away your horse, right? They wouldn't take away your wagon, right? And so many slave owners argued, and they would go to court over this if necessary. Slave is my property. You can't take away my horse or my wagon. What right do you do to have my take away my slave? So you could see the legal quagmire that slavery also certainly had, and there were thousands of court cases and legal cases over the issues of slave and transporting slaves across state lines and things like this. Uh, to be truthful, though, the courts generally leaned towards the slave owners in their decisions. All right, women's rights movement we will get into here. Origins of the women's rights movement. Moral reform. This is really where women have their opportunities in this time period to express themselves, to express their views, and to actually have influence upon society as a whole. This really charts a course over the next 200 years to modern times, which I think most women would probably say still hasn't really fully fleshed out. Even in modern society, women would still probably not be considered fully equal. Women still don't make the same amount of money as a man doing the same job. Fortune 500 companies, 87% of those are run by men. Congress, Washington, 80% of congressional representatives. That's not the best way to put it because that's really just the one house of Congress. Let's just say as a whole, 80% of the people in Congress are still men. Um, so even though women account for over half the population, it still really hasn't. Women's rights movement is still ongoing. But it really sort of begins in this time period, the foundation of it. And it lies in this idea of moral reform. This becomes women's opportunities for societal influence in this time period. Many religious middle class women wanted to help other women and children who were less fortunate. This is, in essence, religious charity and institutional charity. It's not just money, it's services and charity and money and opportunity and protection for typically lower working class women by middle class women who often did not work. If you were middle class in this time period, this was before the period like middle class in the 20th century, women worked. We saw lots of women working. Even if the media image was that they didn't, they actually did. In this time period, if you were a middle class woman, you didn't work normally. You did not have a paid job of any sort. You worked, but you worked at home, taking care of the family, taking care of the kids, which certainly was work. You just weren't paid for it. This is an actual place where women leave the private sphere, go out into the public, and using this idea of moral reform to help the less fortunate. Specifically, usually focused on women and children of the lower working class, immigrants as well. Female Moral Reform Society is formed in New York. It's formed around this time period, 1830s, 1840s. I don't have an exact date. It was focused on ending prostitution and protecting women from moral corruption. What does that mean? It's pretty vague. Anything that would violate the Ten Commandments, anything that would violate religious morality, adultery, prostitution, drinking, drugs, any type of criminal activity, anything that would threaten your soul. It had over 40,000 members at its height across the nation. This went outside of just New York. It really began in New York and had its largest influence in New York, but we do see it going into multiple states. It employed women and offered guidance. It didn't employ women to work, but it actually employed women as part of the organization to do outreach. This has a lot of religious foundations to it because it was about morality, which of course is religious. Even though it is not tied to a specific religious institution, it is really Christian morality outreach to the poor working classes, especially women. Offer guidance, they would visit brothels, they would do outreach, prayer, refuge homes. Refuge homes could take the form of like halfway houses, poor houses, even refuge for domestic abuse. They didn't use the term domestic abuse back in. They used the term. I'm blanked on the moment. I talk about another chapter. The idea of home protection, I think, is the term I use. The idea of home protection. Of course, who were you protecting it from? Your husband, typically husband and father. So it was protect women who are abused, or through today we use the term domestic violence. They didn't use that terminology back then, but it's what it is. It's what they're talking about. So focusing on prostitution, things like they would sing hymns, they would hand out Bibles, they would have prayer meetings, believing, and what makes this so effective is Christian outreach usually was in the form of prayer and guidance. It often didn't put its money where its mouth was. Most Christian outreach didn't actually put people up or form breadlines or soup kitchens or homeless shelters. They didn't do that. It was about moral conversion and moral protection. These new societies we start to see in this time period, in the mid 1800s, in large part due to the Industrial Revolution, the large amount of immigrant working class people and unwed mothers, they actually put their money where their mouth is. They actually build institutional forms that support the poor and the indigent. As I said, things like some of the things I mentioned. So it's certainly effective. It certainly makes a difference. To continue with it, let's look at some of the other things that come out of this moral reform, this idea of reforming and helping people in American society. Prisons, asylums, and educational movements. Dorothea Dix was emotionally abused by her alcoholic father, physically abused by her alcoholic father as well, and as an adult, she wanted to help save children from a similar fate. She wanted to help protect children from moral and physical abuse from an alcoholic father. Now, there's lots of abuse that doesn't involve alcohol. But as I mentioned before, for most Christian reformers in this particular time period, early America, the focus on alcohol was the belief, very fully this belief, that alcohol was the root of all evils. So alcohol is almost always where they started. Believing temperance, limiting or stopping drinking would be the fix for so many of society's ills. And truthfully, alcohol was often associated with these things. Domestic violence is often associated with alcoholism, abuse, prostitution, brothels, bars. All of those things are often associated. It was very common in this time period for bars, taverns to be actually in the same buildings as brothels because the men would come and drink. And then after drinking, spending money there, they would go spend their money on a prostitute upstairs or in the back rooms. So alcohol was often associated with the vices and ills of society. Dorothea Dix saw it the same way. She wrote books. She created charity schools. She wrote 7 different books. She was an incredibly important and very significant in the women's rights movement. In 1841, she began a campaign to improve care for mentally ill, to establish mental asylums. In this time period, and actually for really the next 100 years, It's really common to put mental ill people who commit crimes just in the regular prison system, right alongside perfectly sane people with no mental illness who are criminals. And which she's one of the first people to start to argue that mental illness, and if you commit a crime under the influence of mental illness, it should be treated as mental illness, not as a crime per se. There needs to be different treatments for someone who commits, say, crime X and they're mentally ill versus a non-mental ill person who commits crime X. So she believes there should be mental asylums and they should be separated in some way. She leads this mental asylum building movement and she really wants to separate them. It has limited effect. It certainly happens, and we see many asylums being built over the next century. But it really does begin this movement towards non criminalization of the mentally ill, but it is a very slow process. Even by the late 20th century, we still are criminalizing mentally ill people. It's improved over the years, but this is still a problem that's in our society today, almost 200 years after Dorothea Dix was doing what she was doing. Many women also support the movement for elementary education and establishing standards in education. Most of our early teachers initially were men. In the mid 1800s, a lot of our teachers were becoming women. This became an accepted woman's job in the public, was as a teacher. Just about in the mid 1800s, just about the only truly normative public jobs for women were nursing and teaching. Really. Almost any other job was thought either inappropriate for a woman to be doing in public or a man should be doing it. Yeah. Lots of women are recruited to be teachers. We see lots of women being teachers, and we see all kinds of new reforms to actually create teacher schools, teacher training schools. Interesting here in California, even though California becomes a state right around this time period, 1850, most of our colleges in California, most of our Cal State colleges, all began as teacher training schools. It's actually common for colleges to begin as teacher training schools. Teachers for the K through 12. Very common. There was an argument made by many women that women were the best. I might get my dog on my lap here in a minute. There was many arguments made by women that women were the best qualified to be teachers, to teach morals and instruction to youth, because of course that's what they did for their own kids. This was one of the routes for women into the public. Teacher training, nursing, things like this, because they used their moral authority at home over the family, where they were a quasi teacher, a quasi nurse for their families and kids, and they were able to translate that into the public, which was really good. This was, in essence, a doorway for women to go from the private to the public, have independence, a form of equality, money in their pockets. Actually, some women actually having careers, like Dorothea Dix. She's very influential. When the Civil War begins, some 20 years after this, Dorothea Dix is actually in charge of 40,000 nurses, some 40,000 nurses for the Union Army. Abraham Lincoln puts her in charge of the. She's the woman. There might be a man as well, but she's the woman in charge of all the nursing staff for the Sanitary Commission. Sanitary Commission is what was created to deal with all the medical, the doctors, the nurses, the morgue, having to deal with all the dead bodies during the American Civil War. Definitely one of the most important women in this period of time in American history. Certainly incredibly influential, Dorothea Dix was. Catherine Beecher also argues that she published books, she wrote articles, she actually founded teacher academies and academies for girls' education. She argued again that women were the moral leaders of America, and that as a result of this, women should be given more opportunities to use their their moral compass to influence our society. That it will only be a good thing. Because there's such a huge focus on America being moral in this time period and religious observance. And remember, the mid 1800s, we have the Second Great Awakening, and women just sort of lean into it and say, you know, right, that's right, absolutely, and we should be the ones we should be ones leading the way as moral leaders. It's certainly significant. It certainly is helpful for women and gives them opportunities in the public. Good discussion question. I've already given you enough, so let's just talk about this one. Well-ordered family. Why is this a well-ordered family? What is it about this in the mid 1800s that make this a perfect family, a well-ordered family? Well, first, they're obviously middle class. They have status. Look at their clothes. They have a rug on the floor. Their entire floor is carpeted, not rug, it's a carpet. That right there is huge. Most people had bare floors. So the fact that their whole floor is covered in carpet, they're dressed nice. He's got a suit on. Look at her big fancy dress. She doesn't work for a living. She takes care of their 3 kids. You know another thing that makes them middle class or even upper middle class? They have pets. Most poor people couldn't put food on the table regularly for themselves, much less feed animals. They have pets. Look at this fancy couch over here. They have paintings on the wall. Um, Very impressive. This is the well-ordered family. This is the image of the perfect family. The nuclear family of 5, where the affluent husband takes care of the family. The kids are all taken care of. They're going to get an education. He has a job or career. What's his job or career? What is it, you wonder? Look out the window. That actually will tell you. This is a nice home. It would not have been down on the waterfront. This is right next to their ships right here. There's trains here. There's a city in the background. This probably indicates his occupation. He's probably in something in shipping or transportation. This nice home like this, middle class family, would not be on the waterfront. That's where the poorest people lived, the most indigent people, the worst housing was down on the waterfront. So he would not have lived down there. So the fact that the window indicates this means most likely this was something to do with his job or career, probably. The woman is here knitting, crocheting, sewing. I don't know, whichever it is. I don't know the difference exactly. Um, so this is a well-ordered family. He's taking care of the family. He's the good husband. I think the actual title of the painting is The Good Husband. Why is he a good husband? He provides for the family, takes care of them, gives a nice place to live. He's got a career. The woman can stay at home taking care of the kids. They obviously have a nice, stable family. Um, this is a picture that would have probably been on the walls of a lot of up and coming families. A goal to aspire to. So you, if you were poor, you were just now starting to establish yourself in America, hoping to work your way up the social ladder, which was certainly a way. It's what made America different. You could start dirt poor in America, and you actually could work your way up the social ladder. Lots of people, millions of people did. You could start at the bottom, and by the end of your life, you could be well into the middle class, provide for your family. This was a country that allowed that. Not everyone got there, of course, but most other places in the world, you didn't have the opportunity. If you were started at the bottom, you stayed at the bottom your entire life. America, you could start at the bottom and work your way up. A lot of people did. And they would put a picture like this, a print. This is eventually made into many different copies, and you might hang it on your wall and be like, this is what we are aspiring to as our family. One day we'll achieve that. Something like that. This idea of the perfect family life. This is what people valued in this time period. If you were an American and you were not rich, which was most, you aspired to something like this, regardless of color. This really is not a color thing. This isn't really a race thing. This isn't even really an ethnic thing. It's not even a religious thing. No matter what your religion was, your ethnicity, or your skin color, you aspire to something like this: independence, comfort, providing for a family, having healthy young kids, having a nice home to live in. Everybody wanted this. Today, we would refer to this sort of as the American dream. Everybody wants this, some version of this. It isn't here, of course, it's very gender normative. It's husband, wife, male, female, and kids. But no matter what the gender issue is, no matter what the sexual issue is, no matter what your desire to have kids or not, everybody aspires to this form of comfort and prosperity. Not necessarily to be rich, but to be comfortable. Everyone wants that. And that's what this is. This was what the norm in America that people wanted to achieve. And the last thing we'll discuss in this section is abolitionist women. This is another route that women took in this time period. Less accepted, much more criticized. But that's just because of the general nature of abolition, which was very controversial and lots of critics of abolitionist ideas in this time period. Maria Stewart was a black lecturer. She spoke about slavery to mixed audiences and Boston. Big problem. She got death threats. She spoke to white black audiences, free and escaped slave, fugitive slave, and male female audiences. Yeah. Harriet Jacob wrote Incidents in Life of a Slave Girl. You should read it. It's not very long. You can find it online. It is intense. So make sure you're ready for it if you do choose to read it. It talks about how bad it is to be a slave girl on a white plantation. The worst abuse, even though she was raped, the worst abuse she actually received was from the mistress, the white slave mistress. Because a white woman in slave society has no power any more than a black woman, except over slaves. A white woman, a white wife, has really zero power in the white society, but in the black society, she's queen. She can treat slaves well. The worst treatment the slave girl received was probably from her white mistress who abused her and tortured her. It describes forced sexual relations, slavery, rape. It's you got to be prepared before you read it if you read it, but it really tells you a lot about what it was like to be a female slave. Really, so much when you see slave stories and you read about slavery, it's always from the male perspective. It's really weird, but even in slavery and slave stories and depictions of slavery, it's patriarchal. The stories almost all focus on what it was to be a male slave, the way men were abused, tortured, murdered, lynched, all that kind of stuff in chains. And yet, life for female slaves was just as bad and was just as torturous, even in other ways. Men obviously were not commonly raped. Female slaves were commonly raped by white masters and also other slaves. Domestic slavery. This is also an interesting thing. This is white women. Many white women argued that they were also a form of slave. Now, you'd have to say probably a lot of them didn't really understand what it was to be a real slave. I mean, obviously, from Maria Stewart, Harriet Jacobs' point of view. But they argued, there's some fairness to it, that women obviously were, misogyny was the norm in the society. Patriarchal society, women were often, legally and socially, most white women were treated equal to children. Most white women couldn't own property. They had almost no legal rights. They were treated socially, culturally, educationally, almost on the level of a child. And so they argued that women's subservience, women's inferior status, legally, culturally, politically, is also a form of slavery. And I think that's a fair argument. It is. It doesn't compare to what black women went through necessarily, but it certainly is a form of what we would call this idea of domestic white slavery under the society that had here. Women treated as inferior, and they were anytime a woman ever tried doing something publicly, they were constantly challenged. Anytime a woman tried stepping out of the private into the public, challenged by society, by husbands, by men in general. They were often challenged. In response to these restrictions, women really seemed to support women's rights movements. They challenged the traditional gender roles. They challenged this idea that women had to be subservient and treated as inferior, and that women should have opportunities in the public. Women should have rights. And one of these ways that they actually do this is abolition. We see multiple women taking a stand on abolition. Many women actually find this as their voice. And they often focus on female slaves, that they are going to protect women from being abused, assaulted, because most people would have agreed that rape was bad, even though rape was common. They would say rape was a bad thing. And so one focus of these women was talking about domestic slavery of white women, but they also would use it in conjunction with talking about slavery and sexual abuse of black women, specifically black slaves. They challenge this whole idea of a woman having to be a domestic servant or subservient wife, and they called it this idea of domestic slavery. So this abolitionist movement, plus this idea of women taking an active role in moral reform, does this equally form a freedom for women? I would argue it does. I would argue this is a step moving towards freedom and equality for women in American society. They argued for general, better treatment of women of all classes, more political and social opportunity for women, and I believe it was a step in the direction of actual equality. And I think this is most heavily evidenced by what happens within 100 years, less than 100 years when all this is happening, women get the right to vote. We see women lawyers and doctors. We see the first women in Congress. The way I always look at it, because I'm a historian, I look at it as everything's relative. And the relative aspect of women's rights is, I put it simply this way. Recorded history goes back approximately 5,000 years. And that's where historians begin. Anything before recorded history is really the purview of anthropologists and archaeologists and all that kind of stuff. Recorded history is about 5,000 years approximately. For 4,800 of that 5,000 years, women were pretty static. Their rights, opportunities, their status in society in general, worldwide, and I studied world history and US history. Generally speaking, women's rights and opportunities in world history have fluctuated minimally for 4,800 years. Then, around 200 years ago, things started to change, and opportunities for women started to expand and widen. To today, women are close to equal. Again, I still would say women are still not fully equal in our society, but they're fairly close, relatively speaking, in world history. In essence, if world history is all of this, for all of this, 99% of it, women's authority and power really didn't shift. And in the last 200 years, it's increased dramatically. So, relatively speaking, I think this is certainly an important movement in the right direction, and it is certainly far more advancement than women have ever seen in the previous thousands of years. So, I think it's significant. I really think it's a significant thing. This whole, even though it's limited, I think it's very significant. All the things we talked about in the last 20 minutes or so. Okay, that's where our chapter ends, and that's where I'm going to. There's a lot more in your book, by the way. I don't know if I said it before, but I do skip a lot of things because you have to limit what you can talk about, and you have to limit certain topics. And when I do this lecture in class, it takes almost the full 3 hours because every one of those things that I talk about discussion, I spend 5 or 10 minutes talking about and asking for people's opinions and et cetera, et cetera. So that's why I skip so many things because I need to get this whole lecture done within a certain time period and also have class discussion. So there's a lot of things in the book I don't talk about. Feel free to look at that, examine it, even though for testing purposes, I already, I only test stuff that I talk about in the lecture. So take care and we'll see you next time.